Hello and welcome back to Truss Issues, our podcast where we unpack the first 100 days of Liz Truss's premiership and her time in number 10. Now, it's safe to say the first 100 days have already got off to a very interesting start. Not only do we have a new Prime Minister, but we also sadly have a new monarch. So to reflect on all of the changes and the instant turmoil that Truss has found herself in, I'm joined by Ben Blissett, TLDR UK's lead writer, and Nelson Fernandez-Serre, TLDR EU's lead writer. Ben, welcome to the podcast. Your first time. You weren't here last time.
I wasn't.
You missed a big week.
I planned this a couple of months ago, and it became clear that we'd have a new Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So I missed obviously the first.
You're
episode
already
of Truss
angry
Issues.
about missing that.
Yeah, and then we've got a new monarch, and I missed all of that last week as well. But I'm back for this one. We've got a lot to talk about.
We do.
So
I'm sure we'll get holiday again.
Yes. Well, I mean that seems to be the only logical solution.
We've written it out of your contract. You're not able to go anymore.
Last week has reduced my holiday days.
Or do we just let him go because when he's not here, stuff happens? Well, not all good stuff, admittedly, but
The thing is, when he's not here, stuff happens because you can actually get stuff written. When he's
that's
not
true.
here.
Anyway, there's clearly a lot going on at the moment, and there's a lot going on kind of outside of the realm of politics too. There's not the normal, very early policy proposals going through. There's not the Commons debates. There's not all those kind of things, which is kind of the core focus of this podcast is meant to be around what is she doing in these first 100 days. The answer so far is not a whole lot from a policy perspective, so it's kind of disappointing for the podcast from our trajectory. But there's still a lot to talk about. So this probably won't be as long an episode as normal, and it'll be a bit weirder than our normal episodes, or at least not our normal format.
Yeah.
But let's start with what we kind of have to start with, the only news in the UK at the moment, the Queen's passing. Now, we've made a number of videos on this before, so we don't really need to go into the whole what's happened. I feel like everyone ought to know by this point. But from a strictly political perspective, what's happened so far? What's Parliament done? What's happened in politics specifically in reaction to the Queen's passing?
Well, it's notable. I think it's worth just picking up what you said, is that, we were expecting the first few podcast episodes to go through, because when Truss was announced as, or when we found out that this leadership election was taking place, the next Prime Minister, it was Truss or Sunak, was going to have a very busy first couple of weeks if everything went as we expected. We've got the energy crisis at the minute, inflation crisis, the economy's doing incredibly badly. There's a lot of tricky challenges that the Prime Minister has to deal with. And those things are still there. Those things they still have to deal with. Obviously, it's all had to be pushed back a bit, because as part of the mourning, the 10 days of mourning until this coming Monday, the funeral, we've got Parliament is not going to sit. The government's not going to make any major announcements. In essence, politics is almost suspended for all intents and purposes until after the funeral.
Sure.
But as I say, all of these things still persist. The energy price cap changes on the 1st of October. Truss has already announced last week that she would maintain the cap at £2,500. It's going to go up to £2,500 on the 1st of October, and we'll try and maintain that by borrowing a huge amount.
Which is an increase of what already?
It's about £600, about £1,900. £1,900, at the minute it'll go to
and it's capped at that point going forward from now, but
Correct.
it's still going up. In
still
October, we will still have a hike that we will all experience, and a certain segment of society will struggle with more than others.
The separate £400 payment still exists.
Okay.
So that is still happening. The important thing to note is that the funeral for the Queen is on the 19th of September.
Yes.
This coming Monday.
It's a bank holiday.
The price cap changes on the 1st of October.
Yeah.
So she has some time in between to sort that. The important thing here, because she's already announced that that's going to happen for individuals.
Yeah. The
important thing here is that because businesses don't have the energy price cap. So she said that they will receive similar support to keep the threshold at a roughly similar level, but she hasn't announced what that's going to be.
Okay.
It was businesses are saying at the minute that they need an announcement in the next few days, which would fall within the mourning period, which the government can't make announcements with, or else so they can get plans in place. They know how their business is going to cope at Christmas. They need notice for this sort of thing. The difficult thing is she can't. She just can't. So she's got a lot. But my point here is that she has a lot that she needs to do. These crises are still happening. She in a normal week, if the Queen hadn't died last week, she'd be doing all of that this week.
Yeah.
But her role now is almost as a supporting figure to the new king. And the only sort of like recent example we have of Liz Truss's and what she has to do at the minute is Tony Blair in 97. Now, when Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 97, he had about 3 months, and then Diana obviously died in a car crash in Paris. And he had to sort of act as a supporting figure for the nation, someone the nation could turn to, because as the Queen has already, she admitted in privately and things like that she didn't deal with that probably as best as she probably wished she had in hindsight. So it sort of fell on the Prime Minister to do that. The Prime Minister then had to take a much more leading role in tributes and holding the country together. Right now, the country's turning more to the King, and by all accounts, his speeches so far have been doing that. So Liz Truss's job at the minute is more to act as a supporting figure to the King, to give that support to the country at the minute. So this wasn't what was expected to happen. That wasn't meant to be what she was doing this week, but that is her role until Monday, is to sort of keep politics out of it and act more as a supporting figure.
How would you say that Truss has responded so far, Nelson? How do you think the public are perceiving her reaction to this, her speeches, what she's had to say?
Yep, so it's obviously early days, and opinion polling has basically been suspended as well. So it's difficult, but I do expect there to be a slight bounce in her approval rating, because it's at times like this that the nation binds itself together. It's at times like this that we rally around the flag, whoever's holding the flag. And I do think that her speech wasn't the best piece of speech work, but part of that is just that Truss isn't the best speaker as a person. So I do think that she did the best job she could, and to be plunged into this constitutional country crisis is, in your first week in office, is going to be tough for anyone.
I just sort of interject there and say that I largely agree that she's not a great orator, and that her speech wasn't, the best it could be. But I don't think by any means was bad. I don't think she got flack for it. She didn't get controversy for it. I know that that's largely what you're saying. I just want to emphasise that.
I do think Boris Johnson's speech in the Commons was a substantially better speech. Again, Liz Truss's speech wasn't bad. It was the best she could have done. But yeah, so it's not, she hasn't thrown it all away.
Yeah, I think she certainly could have done a more cohesive job of pulling the nation together through that speech. But equally, in a normal job, she'll have barely got her laptop and her computer login by that point in the week. Like, she was so early in her premiership that, reacting to this at all was going to be difficult. So I think a passable reaction is probably, as you say, still could reward her with some kind of boost.
She would have spoken and conversed with the Queen a matter of hours beforehand.
Yeah.
Something like 24, 48 hours before.
Yeah.
And to have the person you've just talked to, that you've just had the honour of your life to be appointed Prime Minister, go.
Yeah.
And you're having to be the front person for that. It's going to be difficult for anyone. It's going to be a toll on someone's mental health, let alone a new Prime Minister.
Absolutely. And when it comes to what Truss is doing from now on, you obviously said she's supporting the King, but in practical terms, what is it that she'll be doing? Is she got specific plans, specific agenda, specific places she's going at this point, or are we not certain on those details?
Well, it's important to note that, firstly, the King, and this was part of, is it Operation Golden Orb? Is that what it's called? There was an operation basically for the King.
They got some good operation names, it turns out.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure that's what it's called. I'm sure we're going to have something on screen. But anyway.
Giving Scarlett work to do?
Yes. The King, upon becoming king after the death of the Queen, one of his first jobs is to go around the 4 nations of the United Kingdom to try and present himself as a king of all 4 nations. Truss is going to be going to the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. I don't know how. There's been a bit of a divergence there's a bit complicated because the King is going and doing a load of official engagements. I don't think Liz Truss is doing you were reading a bit more about this.
So the first statement that Downing Street put out...
It was a bit conflicting, wasn't it?
Seemed to suggest that Liz Truss would be accompanying the King, on his tour of the country.
Yeah.
That got political pushback because it's
bringing politics into...
It overruled the separation between Crown and State. So that now has been rowed back, and what Downing Street are now saying is Liz Truss will accompany the King on his visits, but won't on the actual tour.
Okay.
So on the actual ceremonies, she's going to be there as a representative
But
of the government, but not as like...
Which I think
Yeah.
the separation thing's important. I think surely the optics too
Exactly.
of she obviously can't be in Parliament passing legislation, but people expect she's doing something rather than just going round in a royal parade, which ordinarily might be acceptable. But right now you can see why people wouldn't necessarily take well to seeing her in that situation.
And we are expecting more or less chaos in London over the next few days
Yeah.
when it comes to the Queen's body being lying in state. There are some rumours that government are planning for London to be quote-unquote full and for contingency plans to be in place to basically shut down the rail network to anyone that's non-essential. So this could be a major, major test for the government if we're having thousands, if not millions of people entering the capital. And the policing around that is going to be major. And Liz Truss is going to have a hand on the button for resolving it and making sure she's there, active, taking a role.
Sure.
Well, it's just to go back to your original question of what she's going to be doing this week. Largely, as Nelson said, she'll be going on, to the four nations of the United Kingdom. She's just because Parliament isn't sitting, the government aren't announcing anything. I think it's fair to assume that she's also going to be planning for next week after the funeral. Because as I said at the start, there's a lot that still needs to be done. She still needs to announce those energy caps for businesses. There's still the inflation crisis. She's got some other crises she has to figure out with the Bank of England in terms of their policies at the minute. It suggested that we could be heading we're very close to a recession that she has to deal with. Especially, as you said, there's a bank holiday on Monday for the Queen's death, which isn't going to help in terms of the economy either. So there's a lot that she has to do next week, but she's going to be planning for that this week. She's going around the country, and she's generally just providing support and trying to be a unifying figure.
It's the equivalent of a political reading week.
Sure. Okay, so we're coming back refreshed with new information and ready to go.
Yeah.
Obviously, Ben touched on the kind of comparison to Tony Blair when he first entered office. But Nelson, would you, with all of your political historical knowledge, would you say that this is one of the most unusual opening weeks of a premiership in at least modern history? And how do you think she'll come out of it? Do you think she'll be able to succeed in uniting the country alongside the new king, or do you think that'll be a bit of a struggle?
Yep. So this was never in the job description.
No.
We all knew that the Queen had to die eventually. She's not immortal, but no one expected her to die so suddenly after the change of Prime Minister. So it obviously isn't easy for Liz Truss. The job she inherited wasn't easy, as Ben has said already, that we have crises on multiple fronts, and this just won't help.
Yeah.
I'm not personally a fan of the comparison to Tony Blair's situation. More, I see this as Winston Churchill when the Queen actually became the Queen following the death of her father, in that the Prime Minister there, Winston Churchill, supported the Queen in getting used to the role. But the problem is that situation is the same now, except back then Winston Churchill was he was a statesman. He knew how politics and the crown interacted. Liz Truss doesn't.
Yeah.
She has experience in ministerial office, but she doesn't have experience dealing with the crown. And the thing that makes it slightly better is that King Charles, as Prince, had what people have termed the longest apprenticeship in history. So he has been preparing for the role.
Yeah.
And obviously, he is a human. Losing your mum will hit him badly, and I do feel like pushing him out to the public stage is going to be difficult for him.
Yeah.
Because losing your mother is difficult for anyone. But the fact he's been the heir apparent for so long is going to make it easier. Because planning would have been in place for that.
Because ordinarily, when a new prime minister comes in, the monarch is one of the people who's there to support and guide, and vice versa. And now you've got two people looking for support without... Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the things that's been commented on specifically, I heard John Major mention it especially, is the historical knowledge and wisdom that the Queen brings with her in the fact that she's seen generations of prime ministers and political history, and she's able to give advice based on previous precedent and previous situations. And sure, as you say, Charles would have been watching that closely, but he wouldn't have been in the room for those conversations. And now you've got two people in quite a difficult situation. I put the second part of that question to you again, Ben, on the uniting the country. That's clearly a core focus of Truss's premiership generally, and especially having just lost the Queen. Do you think that's something she'll be able to do? And do you think she's off to a good start with uniting the country when it comes to the politics rather than the monarchy?
Yes, it's quite difficult, really, because she came in last week, and Truss, as we found out in the leadership election, is quite a right-leaning figure. She's got quite the support of the right of the Conservative Party. And she tried to install some of those to more prominent positions last week before the Queen, before we had the announcement about the Queen, which caused a bit of controversy. So she came in almost, not deliberately, but as a divisionary figure, someone who was trying to
overthrow the orthodoxy.
Yeah, overthrow. And I think, she did that through getting rid of a couple of senior civil servants. She tried to she was talking about getting rid of Simon Case, who's a principal private secretary?
Cabinet secretary.
Cabinet secretary, sorry, the cabinet secretary.
Okay.
Also, Sir Tom Scholar, who was in the
permanent secretary to the Treasury.
He was in the Treasury, permanent secretary to the Treasury. So she tried to get rid of a couple of senior civil servants. She also, in her appointments to cabinet positions, appointed some quite right-leaning figures as well.
Okay.
And then, so following, trying to, and she's well within her rights to do that, but that's
absolutely.
quite a divisionary thing to do.
Yes.
She's then been hit with having to become a unifying figure.
Yes.
Luckily, they're separate enough that I don't think that's made much of an impact. So obviously, they're political appointments to start with. This is more of like a country coming together thing. So I think they're separate enough that it doesn't actually make too much of a difference that she came in as a divisionary figure. It just, her focus has had to change slightly in the last week.
Yeah.
And it will probably be until Monday, and then politics will slowly start to resume again, and that can carry on. So it's a difficult task. She's playing a bit of a support role to the king at the minute.
Yeah.
But she did actually, interestingly enough, come in as a bit more of a divisionary figure, and she had to put that on hold slightly.
Yeah.
But I think that they're separate enough that it doesn't mean that it's going to undermine her unifying
Even still,
challenge.
you can imagine that she came in with these big, decisive and divisive decisions, and was hoping that she could make a big change up front, appoint a bunch of new people, a bunch of loyal people, and then slowly over time build the party back together, bring people back together ahead of 2024. I'm sure this is only a week or two's disruption to that plan, but it's interesting that she made the strike, the big cut, and yet the healing process and the bringing together hasn't been able to be even as quick as she might have wanted it to be. Do you think she'll be able to turn it around in that respect? Obviously, Ben said this is early days, like this is the kind of two separate issues, but do you think this is a concern for her, or is it too early to tell, Nelson?
I do think it's too early to tell. The only thing I would say is getting rid of some of these senior civil servants at this time is probably the worst decision she could have made. She wouldn't have seen this in hindsight, but she wouldn't have seen this beforehand, sorry.
Yeah.
But the fact that she's almost changing the furniture of a burning building, it's all going to come down eventually. So I honestly do think that these decisions won't impact what happens next. It's going to be what she does now.
Yeah.
In that she now has a platform to rebuild the country, to unite the country around the new king. The problem is she going to be able to? And I do think it's still too early to tell. She is trying to be unifying in her speeches, and she is trying to genuinely reach out, as we've seen with the energy price cap, finally giving some support to businesses, although the detail we don't know yet.
Yeah.
So the fact that she's almost going against her natural instincts in doing this shows that she's making an effort. Whether that effort is going to be enough to shift the opinion polls, to shift country sentiment, it's still too early.
Finally then, Ben, we discussed this last week when you weren't here, but do you think that she is a good candidate to pull the party and the country together ahead of 24? Do you think that she has good odds at this point, or do you think she's not necessarily got the right attitude, the right policies, the right leadership style?
Well, it's interesting because in the last few weeks, she's obviously been mainly trying to appeal to a select electorate, the Conservative Party, and even more specific than that, the right of the Conservative Party. I think it's quite early to tell. It's a bit. I mean, obviously, all these caveats place, but too early to tell, etc., etc. But and it all sort of depends on what she does in the next few months and whether she continues with that approach of trying to appeal to the right of the party. If she does continue this approach to the right of the party, which I suspect is probably what's going to happen, then I think she's going to find it quite difficult in 2024 because you're going to have some members of the Conservative Party who don't like it, and then those on the left and swing votes are going to find it quite difficult. Especially because she doesn't have... Boris Johnson might have appealed to a certain fraction of the Conservative Party, but he had a bit more of a broader appeal through his personality, his image, how bombastic he was at times.
Yeah.
Liz Truss doesn't have that sort of strength of character to try and bring in people who might not be ideologically aligned to her as well, which is a significant disadvantage. So I think from her perspective, she kind of has to, if she wants a chance at 2024, she has to try and broaden her ideological appeal, which I think is quite unlikely considering the base that she's gone for. Plus, that would frustrate her supporters because people voted for her in the Conservative leadership race on the grounds that she's quite a right-leaning candidate.
And her own MPs backing her too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think she's going to find it very difficult in 2024 because the way that she's presented herself was perfect for winning the Conservative leadership election.
Yeah.
But it's made it, and she's tied her own hands for the 2024 general election, if it's not earlier.
Yeah.
Because she's made herself appeal to a very specific portion of the electorate, not the wider electorate.
Okay. Well, thank you both. It's been an interesting start to Liz Truss's premiership and an interesting start to this podcast. We were expecting to be analysing policies and comparing how she was doing against the 9 broad objectives. Obviously, we haven't even touched on those on this episode just because there hasn't been any notable progress. We will wait and see what happens. Our next episode is due out on Friday, so we'll be back then to discuss more about what's happened this week as the time plays out following the Queen's passing. Ultimately, as we've highlighted here, not much can be expected news and policy-wise until next week, really. But we'll keep you updated. We'll keep paying attention. We'll see what's going on. And we will join you again on Friday for your next episode of Truss Issues. Thank you both.
Thank you.